Hello, everybody, and welcome to our third think tank, Vertiports in Latin America. It's great to have you all here. When we talk about urban air mobility, it sparks the imagination about the future cities and new generation types of aircrafts flying around servicing people at our cities. And of course, it evokes a new type of aviation. And this new generation of aircraft, as we have seen, are the enabling technologies for urban air mobility to actually happen. But as we all know, there's a lot of other pieces to the puzzle. The aircrafts themselves cannot operate on their own. They need a lot of other systems operating as well. We need places for them to land and take off. These places are called vertiports, and the vertiports bring together all those other pieces like passenger management, like integration into other modes of transportation, like the airspace traffic management for those air vehicles, like energy management. And indeed, in the end, it's actually at the vertiports where all the magic of urban air mobility is going to happen. Hi, everybody. My name is Felipe Varon, and I'm the CEO and founder of Varon Vehicles. And today we have a very interesting panel. I want to introduce our guests here today. We have Charles Clauser. He's the Senior Director of Architecture and UAM Lead for PS&S Integrated Services, a New Jersey-based architectural, engineering, and environmental design firm. He's a commercial pilot, flight instructor, and he's a board member of the American Helicopter Museum and Educational Center in Pennsylvania. Sankar Vilupuram, he leads digital services for Arab in East Asia. He has over 20 years of experience in design and implementation of transformational smart operational solution, leveraging Internet of Things and data analytics across various domains, including construction. He has managed several landmark projects in Hong Kong. Joining us as well is Gary Vermaak from Air Taxi Now. They're developing a rural air mobility ecosystem to develop Africa's rural and empower communities. Clement Monnet, he is the former co-founder and CEO of Voom by Airbus, an on-demand helicopter booking platform which operated in Brazil, Mexico, and in the United States. He is now the co-founder of another startup in the field of aviation and software that focuses on solving the infrastructure problem for urban air mobility. Carlos Pardo is a psychologist and urbanist in the New Urban Mobility Alliance, NUMO, who has worked on transportation policies for close to 20 years in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. He was one of the organizers and instructors of MIT's course, Leveraging Urban Mobility Disruptions to Create Better Cities. And we have Adriana Varon, our Varon Vehicles CFO, as well with us. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted in the Skyscraper webpage, varonvehicles.com/skyscraper. So you can revisit this session and any other previous think tanks at any time. Attendees, you are able to submit your questions through the questions and answers button on the bottom of your screen. And at the end, we will have an 8-minute slot in which we'll try to answer as many questions as possible between all panelists. Please note that the language of our think tank is English, but we have live interpretation in both English and Spanish. You just have to go to the interpretation button on the bottom of your screen and choose your preferred language to listen to live interpretation of this session in your language of choice. Por favor, note que el idioma de este think tank es inglés, pero tenemos interpretación en vivo, tanto en inglés como en español. Usted solo tiene que ir al botón de interpretación en la parte baja de la pantalla y escoger su idioma preferido para escuchar interpretación en vivo de esta sesión en su idioma de preferencia. So I want to get started in this conversation by talking about how do we see us implementing these vertiports in actual real cities. And we want to, of course, refer to the Latin American scenario where we have quite a lot of urban density and trying to open space in the existing cities would be a major challenge. So the lack of urban space is one first thing that we realize when we are trying to build these vertiports or choose where to build them. And then the other point is how do we place them, whether it's going to be a ground level or is it going to be on the top of high sky rises, on the top of buildings? And that is a natural first approach because there's a lot of heliports, these landing places for helicopters that are built on the top of buildings. So I want to give it over to our first, in the order that I read them in the introductions, to hear the first thoughts on these points on how do we approach where and how to put these vertiports in our real cities. Charles, over to you.
Thanks. Well, I think that there's a number of points that have to be considered, a whole host of points actually, when we're looking at where to place within the city. And it depends to a large degree on a number of factors. Land available, building, the appropriateness of buildings either existing or where there might be an open space or where there might be an available low-rise building that we can either build on top of or adjacent to. The potential for the extension of site utilities into this new vertiport is important. Certainly zoning, where there might be a change of use if we are occupying upon a host building, let's call it. There is also the consideration of what is the airspace structure in the neighborhood, and certainly between the hub and spoke, if we can use that term, for prime vertiport and its outlying satellite facilities as well. There's also the consideration for a neighborhood evaluation as well to see where sensitive areas are. And I know we're talking about a very, very dense, densely populated municipality, but at the same time, there may be more favorable areas or routes that can be developed between and among the various vertiports that would favor less objectionable areas along that route. So we're looking at not only the site location itself and what the amenities can provide there. And there's a lot of different things to begin to consider. And I think we're going to be talking more about that as we go forward into here. The availability of utilities and the extension of electric or provision for high energy electric there. The neighborhood consensus that would allow the acceptance of a vertiport in a particular area or areas. The neighborhood composition or the route composition, both from an airspace standpoint and from a cityscape standpoint as well. The interconnectivity is the word I'm looking for between air mobility and existing ground mobility, and how the two of them can complement one another. So all of these things are items that we need to look at very, very carefully so that what we're building makes sense, it's economical, it's accepted by the community, it's approvable, it's licensable, it's least disruptive to people's quality of lives, and at the same time, enhancing the quality of life for the traveler, whether it be a tourist, whether it be a commuter, whether it be a traveler, whether it be governmental, scientific, educational, the whole host of things that can support aerial mobility. And all of those things would help inform how best to make this initial selection of a site. They're my initial thoughts.
Right, great. And before I give it over to Sankar, I mean, you touched a very important set of points, which all circle around the fact that we have to be very smart when selecting the location of our vertiports, because the entire system needs to make sense for mobility and especially for integration into existing modes of transportation. So Sankar, your thoughts there?
Yeah, thanks, Felipe. I'm just going to go probably one step away just because coming from Hong Kong, which kind of city do we really think that this kind of vertiports will be useful, or this kind of ataxis will be useful? I mean, Hong Kong, it's challenging first, we are very extraordinarily dense city, and there are alternative transports which are extremely popular. The public transports are available. So the selection of the city or demand itself is going to make an important role of where this is going to make a difference. So I would like to just choose an analogy about, India and China. The mobility increased, mobility as in like mobile communications increased, just because the landlines were non-existent in telephone lines. The cost of putting a landlines is much, much more expensive than having a mobile communications, and mobiles becoming more and more cheaper. So taking the same approach, I was talking to the Jakarta and Taipei smart city heads. They could actually make only one appointment in their cities in a day. They can't do more than one appointment because at least 2 hours for them, one-way journey. So it takes 4 hours for them to do one meeting in a day. So those kind of cities, I bet that there are a lot more opportunities for us just because there's no other alternatives there. So that's the first point about the demand of where this is going to make a huge difference. And the moment that we have a demand in those places where you can't reach or the alternative transport is almost non-existent, then the vertiports probably will be able to solve better. Singapore is just trying to consider this, from an airport to Marina Bay Sands. They're trying to use an air taxi model, but that's more like, point to point in a one-off way, because Singapore is similar to Hong Kong. So that is where we are going to, if you want to do a commercialization and scalable way, it has to have a stronger demand and stronger use case. Then the vertiports problem would automatically be solved. That's my view. You're on mute, Felipe.
There, thanks for that. Yeah, Gary, please, your thoughts on these points.
Okay, from the way I look at it is generally, I mean, if we look at helicopters at the moment, they generally follow waterways for both safety and the fact that it's probably least disruptive, or other rights of ways, so highways and things like that. So one of the things is really, and I've looked at the model that the guys at Transcend are putting together, which is the idea of putting barges on rivers, as for landing pads. So it's very similar to what one of Manhattan's helipads, which is really almost basically a, sort of barge or a weir, as far as I remember. That type of thing. The other opportunity is to actually, by integrating, for example, with a railway station, generally railway stations take up a lot of space. There is opportunities to build on top of the railway station, and it's already zoned for transportation. So, and people are used to the noise of trains coming in and going out all hours of the day. So it makes it a lot easier. It's really, and then also things like, major bus depots, central bus depots, that allows people to quickly move around, especially where you've got rapid bus transit like you have in Colombia, and that, and also, for example, Cape Town and that, where they've got a very strong rapid bus transport system. So, these things can work quite well there. So, and, bus depots generally also have quite a bit of space. So you're not, and if by going upwards, you can effectively create that opportunity without too much of a disruption.
Exactly. And that brings up a very interesting point in the fact, and going over to Clement now, I think you have a lot of experience, of course, to share when it comes to helicopter services. And there's a very important point to give to people, and it's that urban air mobility will very probably at first will not be serving door to door, will not be having people driving from their homes in these flying cars or these new types of air vehicles to the drugstore or to a university. We're not going to be having fulfillment, like bringing your Amazon packages to your door. It's going to be more like Gary was describing, more related to public services where you have these fixed locations and stations, which in our case are vertiports. So over to you, Clement.
Yeah, thank you, Felipe. I want to highlight at first how critical I think the infrastructure issue is for UAM. And I believe that so far this is the least invested vertical of UAM. You have dozens, if not hundreds, of companies that are building the vehicle, the eVTOL, for UAM, and some are making great progress. You have also very serious companies involved in UTM that are making great progress. And obviously some passenger management or B2C platforms that are aggregating demand on mobility and that want to expand in UAM, such as Uber. But I think that the infrastructure stream is the less invested so far. And I read this great article a week ago that was released by McKinsey. There was a partner there, Robin Riddle, specialized in aviation. And I want to quote one sentence that he had in this article, saying that the location of the infrastructure will determine market conversion levels. The closer its passenger is to a takeoff or landing spot, the greater the potential for time savings. If a landing spot is too far away from the origin or destination, the customer might not save enough time for a UAM trip to make sense. And when I read that, I was like, he's spot on an issue that I face almost every day at Voom when I was the CEO of Voom. For context, Voom was basically the first UAM service provider in the world. We were an on-demand helicopter booking platform. We're basically allowing people to book through our app a trip downtown in big cities, from downtown to the airport, or like 10, 12 minutes flight for a distance between 20 to 50 kilometers for 150 to 180 US dollar per person. And we're basically offering an alternative to the ground transfer going through the air. And a major issue that we saw is that obviously the demand is cyclical. And on Thursday, Friday evening, traffic is terrible, and we had a lot of demand. I should have highlighted that our service was live in São Paulo, Brazil, Mexico City, and San Francisco Bay Area. And again, the cities are very congested, especially again Thursday, Friday evening, downtown to airport, same on Monday morning. But if you go on a Tuesday afternoon to the airport, this is actually quite okay. And so basically, our flight was in average 11-minute flight. But if you count the total end-to-end experience for the passenger, from the time they were checking in at the helipads to the time they were arriving at their airline counter, that can be a 40 to 45 minutes total end-to-end experience, because they were arriving 10 minutes before the helipad, we're checking them in, then controlling their ID, then escorting them to the helicopter, then you have the safety briefing, takeoff, landing, and then you have still a transfer from the helipads to the final destination. So if you count a 40 minutes end-to-end experience, UAM makes total sense again when the alternative is maybe 2, 3, or 4 hours on a Thursday or Friday evening. But again, on Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday afternoon, if you start from your place to go to the airport with a cab, it can take 40 to 45 minutes. And then, why would you take a premium? Why would you pay a premium to have UAM? So my point is, UAM does not always make sense if you don't have a comprehensive infrastructure network, because if you have to take your car, your scooter, or whatever, or walk to the nearest helipad and it takes a long time, then UAM does not make sense and it's not relevant. And another issue that I face regularly at Voom that we were facing was traffic at the helipads. Because again, during those peak time, then that's where we had a high peak of demand. But if you have only one helipad in a critical location, then everyone wants to book at the same time. And you can't land several helicopters on a single helipad. So then people have to book at another slot, and that's not then always relevant for their use. So to me, this is just so important and so critical to build this infrastructure network. And my view, as Charles said, is that it will be a hub and spoke model. I believe we will have a mix of what we could call vertiport and vertipad. Vertiport being a place where eVTOL can take off and land, but also recharge, eventually swap batteries. So much larger infrastructure, a little bit like the heliports of today, where a helicopter can park and refuel. And then we'll have the vertipad or vertistop, which is closer to what the helipad are today, just a spot where eVTOL will take off and land. And so then I think it will be mostly where we will build those vertiports and vertipad. I think will be mostly based on demand, especially for vertipad. I think we have to have those vertipad close to where the people needs to start a journey and end a journey. And the vertiport will be mostly the location of the vertiport will be mostly driven by available space, because obviously you need much larger area, bigger space, and that's not obvious to me that we'll find those big location downtown or metropolitan cities like San Francisco, LA, Sao Paulo, Mexico.
Exactly. I mean, Clement, that's right to the point. The fact that we talk about vertiports, it's a new term actually, to move away from helipads. It's because it's a new type of aircraft. It's a new type of service, and these places actually have several what some of us call more technically the FADO areas, or in other cases vertipads at the vertiport. In other words, several landing and taking off places in the same place, in order to accommodate the larger number of the entire logistics that needs to happen in the entire network of vertiports, and the larger number of air vehicles, and the largest number of customers and people as well. So I think this, before passing it over to Carlos to give us his point of view on how do we tackle the lack of urban space that Clement was, of course, mentioning as well, that big challenge. And it goes to Maria Tavarabanovska's question about, as well, that how are infrastructure developers, in other words, us, working with the public to make sure that society is happy with our industry plans? In other words, how do we make sure, if I read it, Maria, correctly, that we really solve people's problems and not create more problems, because that will make people happy. So Carlos, over to you.
Thanks, Silvia. And I think that's a great segue, the importance of understanding how the urban context has specific needs, and that normally when we think about urban mobility, what we're thinking about is how can we reduce the risks of any mode of transport in terms of how are they generating or not externalities to others, and how can we also think about whether there is a question of privacy, of intrusion of privacy, of losing some of the benefits that we have in public space, for example. What we have been working on in the case of Numo is in understanding how to integrate new modes of transport, disruptive modes of transport. So we have been thinking everything from scooters to autonomous vehicles. When we started talking about this and more aerial transport, that we felt it does integrate into the questions that we're asking ourselves. And then we are coming all the way from saying, what if we have a magic carpet that comes into a city? What should we do? How should the policy be associated to them? What should we tell people who own the magic carpet or who operate the magic carpet? And in that context, we started to say, for example, let's have something which is a mobility hub, where what we're trying to achieve is anybody who is doing their first mile of a trip can arrive at the mobility hub and continue the trip in another mode of transport that is cleaner or more efficient. So how can we use this idea of the vertiport, for example, to integrate to that other idea of mobility hub, which is well consolidated now, and it has been happening for a while. And to link into some of the other arguments, how can we identify the best location which makes sense in terms of what the private sector is looking for, and at the same time it provides benefits to users because it is achieving the reduction of travel time, the improvement of some externality, and is not generating any risk on society. And I think that's going to be the balance that we have to achieve, and that we have to keep on having these discussions to see where is it that everybody is agreeing on. I think that's sort of to begin that discussion.
Right, and let me go to the next point of conversation, which is integration. Vertiports need to take into account what we have all expressed here, which is the fact that we need to service the customer. It's about the people that we're servicing. It's not about the aircraft. The aircraft are going to be just a part of that chain in the trip from origin to destination. And that means that people are going to need to probably take other types of transportation to a vertiport, then do the long trip, which of course, like we all mentioned here, will need to add value in terms of time saving. And then from the final vertiport to the person's final destination, there needs to be a rest of the trip, probably with another mode, an electric scooter, a bike, an autonomous vehicle, or some sort of TNC, like any of the transportation network company services that we have globally, to take the person from that vertiport to their final destination. And I don't want to leave out walking, which is something that we do want to incentivize for many reasons. So let me go back and start with Carlos in terms of mobility integration, right? To TNCs and parking places for cars or for electric cars and micromobility, electric scooters, bicycles. How do we see all these modes happening at the vertiport? How do we design those hubs or these vertiports to have all these modes right there in the actual physical infrastructure, and trying to answer a bit of Darrell Swanson's answer here at the same time? If those modes of transportation, he's asking what happens to the urban air mobility business model when ground congestion, the road traffic and private public traffic and subway systems and railroads, when those are significantly reduced by autonomous systems. So in other words, the first and last mile, if there are more autonomous types of transportation modes that we as urban air mobility can integrate into, how does all that make the entire system better? Carlos, give us your intake and then we'll throw it out to the rest of the guys.
So I think maybe the question is the other way around. How does that mobility hub, which already is consolidated and in many cases does exist, how could you integrate a component of some form of air mobility? And I think there are criteria that you could use and say, okay, in this particular place, it makes a lot of sense to have some form of air mobility integrating, because none of the other options which are here in the mobility hub will achieve any of the needs that are there. And then that could be a good way to sort of turn it around. And with regards to the question around autonomous vehicles, there has been a lot of hype around what is expected of autonomous cars. Until 2 years ago, it was very, very high. Now it's been more realistic. I don't think that having a fully autonomous fleet where there is very low congestion will happen any time before the next 30 years or so. And even then, even if you have a full autonomous fleet, there will be congestion. So I think that problem of zero congestion, or I mean, that situation of zero congestion won't really be happening anytime soon. Well, for many reasons, but I think it's sort of, I leave it to the rest to sort of keep on talking about this and see what they think.
Okay, so anybody want to comment on the fact that we need to put all these modes of transportation and build the vertiports around them?
Yeah, if I may, I have some thought on that. You touch upon the business model. I think the business model is going to make a very important decision on about the whole platform. It's an ecosystem. So it's not only about the transport. You talked about maybe the energy, the properties, and all the other supporting industries need to come into play. But the fundamental idea of that to be sustainable, in my view, is at the end of the day, the charges for the passenger should not increase on it. So every supporting ecosystem that's going to come into part of play should be able to make a different methodology of revenue. They're not going to take a portion from the air ticket price or traveling cost. If they're able to make that kind of revenue modeling, which doesn't come from a ticket itself, they could generate that kind of their investment through other kind of revenue modeling. I think that will be more interesting for people to come in. Otherwise, it just becomes a non-inclusive way. It's going to increase the basic cost of travel. and that's going to make it very restrictive. Only the rich or the ultra rich people can do that. And that's not the whole idea of this. If we could make it a reasonably economic method for people to access, and by overcoming their problems, that will be one of the primary driving force for this to be successful and sustainable, in my view.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Felipe, you know, going back to what Carlos said earlier, I think a lot of the cases, I think we've got to try and identify spots that are, within walking distance, a mile at most, from where the client actually is. So whether it's his office, place of residence, whatever, which allows by actually integrating in with existing urban mobility hubs, whether it's a bus depot, railway station, metro station, whatever it is, makes a lot of sense. And what we've already seen in a lot of cities is that a lot of these urban mobility hubs are already, sort of become retail space as well. So, you have a lot of retail around that, whether it's coffee shops, stationers selling books, food stalls, that type of thing. So, that's a good stream of revenue. Back to what Sanko says, a lot of it these days is about making money out of all of these ancillary services. And that also makes it more attractive for the people because, if you can grab a quick bite before you jump on your air shuttle to the airport, it makes a lot of sense. So everybody wins out of that. And again, it brings down the major, let's say, sort of hold back for, current UAM services with helicopters is the landing fees. You take somewhere like London, it costs almost as much the landing fees as it costs to actually do a 20-minute flight for the passenger. You're talking £300 landing fees for a smallish light helicopter. And that's, sort of been a big thing. Other helipads, a few $100s, but, that all adds to the cost. Now, if the helipad or the vertiport, which is part of a greater thing, they're making their money through rentals and whatever else. It means that they don't have to charge those massive landing fees. So they don't kill the business model immediately.
Great. Anybody want to comment on that?
Not counter it, but just to add on to what everyone else was saying, I think that we all have to recognize that these vertiports, that are going to be the entree into what becomes urban air mobility, can't exist just on itself. We just can't concentrate on, designing vertiports, building them, getting the route structure working, satisfying the demand and all of that. I think that the focus of this discussion is in the right vein, in that we have to tie into and show connectivity with existing ground transportation, but do it smartly. I think that as cities move into smart cities, so to speak, globally, what we're looking at is maybe not just thinking about, the existing buses and light rail and taxis and, those kinds of things that are existing that we might want to touch and connect into, but how the next generation of those modalities would make sense. For example, autonomous buses that just go around, they do their route, you pick up you come that way, on a bus from some place that's an autonomous bus. It just does its, circling, and things like that, where I think the integration of the next level up of our ground transportation really needs to be as forward-thinking as what we're all trying to do with the urban air enterprise. So what does that do? That engages the city fathers, the folks that are taking care of the municipalities and the cities and the running of all that, the departments of transportation, and all of those principal entities that help people move around in their daily lives in the city and out to the suburbs and beyond, needs to be part of this conversation. So while we're focusing on the great abilities and the great promise of what urban air is going to bring, I don't think that we're going to see it reach its greatest potential without bringing in these other conversations of ground-based transportation that everybody is talking about here this morning.
Yeah, I'd like to build on Charles' comment and on basically integration with other mode of transportation. Of course, we need to think the end-to-end experience for the customer, which might include several mode of mobility. But I think it's always a flow in the process if we have to combine too much of mode of transportation. No one really likes to have to walk to a station to take a bike or an electrical scooter to a train station, then take the train and then walk or rent another scooter, and switching from different apps. So again, that brings back to how do we make sure that we have the most extensive network of location where we can take off and land. And to that, I want to show that there is a piece that we didn't talk too much about, which is like government and city roles into that. Using the example of LA. LA in the 1970s had built a unique local building code that required new buildings higher than 75 feet to have provisions for emergency landing by helicopter. So that's how you ended up by having, just in downtown LA, 75 helipads, like that. I mean, it was built over time, but with this new ruling, then you had helipads everywhere. And you had a rule like that in São Paulo too. And in São Paulo, you have more than 500 helipads identified in the city. But realistically today, you only have a dozen that you can use for commercial operation because Allianc, the Civil Aviation Authority, some years ago decided to restrict the use of helipads, especially if they were within 500 meters of a school or a hospital. So you see, that's just to show you how a rule 40 years ago can definitely can push the industry, and then suddenly you have all this network of location, and another rule can actually prevent that. So, and obviously the government are driven by what the population wants, and that's fair. So we have to make sure that we build the public acceptance, and we ensure that we show to the population the benefits of UAM, because surely there will be, a noise, even though electrical vehicles makes less noise than helicopter. But we manage, for example, with commercial aviation, to build airports all over our countries. And even though people don't like necessarily the noise of the airport, they see the benefit they have to have an airport nearby. So I wanted to highlight that how city can definitely have an impact on how big the network of infrastructure will be built. And something else that Gary said earlier on business model, to me this is critical, because obviously you need a push for the government, but you have to have entrepreneurs and investors building those vertiports and vertipads. And again, I invite you to read this article from McKinsey. It's called "To Take Off, Flying Vehicles First Need Places to Land." They evaluated the cost of building those different type of infrastructure, and you see that this is very costly. It's cash intensive, and we need to definitely build ancillary revenues for the infrastructure owner and infrastructure operator. The best analogy I can think of is the airport, where airports around the world don't have most of their revenues coming from the landing fees, but from ancillary revenues, retail, for example. So, and that's something that really didn't happen with helicopter, where you see the helipads in most of the mega cities are generating revenues from landing fees almost only, and they don't generate necessarily ancillary revenues with retail inside their buildings. So this is a big piece that has to be developed to help to, again, build this larger infrastructure network.
Because I'm super ignorant in the context of urban air mobility, I want to, I'm going to say a few sentences to see if I understand correctly the context, and then all of you can tell me everything is wrong or partially wrong. There is a, let's say, flying 1.0 scenario, which is what we had until 10 years ago. It's very noisy, large aircraft, which could be either a helicopter or a plane, that has been regulated primarily because it is extremely noisy and it will need a certain strong infrastructure to be able to land. Every policy regulation is related primarily to addressing these issues of the noise and these kinds of externalities. And now what we have is, as I understand it, I'm going to call it a flying 2.0 scenario where vehicles are safer because they have more, they're safer, they are electric, their noise is close to an owl. So the vehicle itself is very different. But what I want to understand is, what would be, like, candidly, what are the risks that this can impose on society that we would have to be careful with if we are, for example, advising a city? Is it, do they have privacy concerns? Is there a risk that they fall from the sky? So I want to understand that better, and would really benefit being very selfish in sort of understanding that context. Am I understanding this correctly, or is there something that I'm missing from that sort of what I'm calling a 1.0 to the 2.0?
I think it's a really good question, and I think it's the kind of thing that has to be asked. After all, the things that we've been kind of touting over the past year, that we all as an industry and as a group trying to advance urban air and advanced air mobility, includes looking at not only the positive things and the bright side, the light side of the ledger, but also examining equally the dark side of the ledger. And that includes risk, primarily. And there are a lot of different, elements of risk to this. But I think, Carlos, one of the very first things that plays into that, or we can begin a discussion on, is sheer volume of these things. So we're not talking about a helicopter that makes an occasional run here and there, or maybe a scheduled single helicopter service from one point to another on a daily basis, where it's currently allowed right now. That's very, very, very low volume compared to the dynamics of this type of enterprise, where there's going to be dozens upon dozens upon dozens networking eventually, across the communities and beyond the communities, linking other areas together. So when you look at that, there's an awful lot of things that have to happen to make that work. It's got to be reliable in order to be safe. Let me put it this way. Reliability helps to usher in safety. And that's not going to come until there's a lot of experience and a lot of data. And none of that is going to happen, none of it, until the data comes in from the testing and the evaluation and the certification process through all the various, countries' aviation agencies. So those elements have to be satisfied first and foremost before they get let out into the community, even if it's on a test basis, even if it's a low risk cargo only basis, it's flying up the river. If they are the beginnings of how we begin to look at stitching all of this together, so that we reduce the different types of risks that are inherent with an enterprise like this, then each one has to be looked at very, very carefully, evaluated, and drive that risk down. And you don't do it artificially. You have to do it by data. You have to do it by time and service. You have to do it by regulation, and all of those things come into play. So, just the fact that these are vertical takeoff and landing vehicles that don't use runways, you're taking an airport and you're compressing it into a spot, so to speak. So your airport now becomes a spot on the planet. And that becomes a big, big, big mobility hub with a lot of, traffic in and out vertically. So that in itself brings with it a huge amount of risk. And until that risk is understood, mitigated, tested, evaluated, and proven, then I think that risk level is high. So yes, we are at, coming into 2.0, and, all of these things have to be satisfied, addressed and satisfied.
I want to say on risk, I second what Charles says. To me, there are two major risks that will be kind of new with UAM and eVTOL versus helicopter. Obviously, volume. This will trigger a whole new type of risk. And Carlos, to give you an idea, at Voom, when we were operating, we were moving 200 passengers per week in São Paulo. And that's already dramatically larger than what any helicopter operator was doing before, and that's still much lower than what we expect to do with eVTOL, because indeed eVTOL will be cheaper, quieter, safer, which will help to drive more demand. One example is if you think of security in terms of before flights. Today, if you take a commercial flight, you have a whole bunch of security procedures before boarding your plane. In the US, for example, we have TSA for almost 20 years now. Will we have something like that for UAM? Today, in general aviation, meaning private flights, helicopter flights that have low volume, you don't have the type of security like TSA-like when you arrive at a private airport. If you imagine that we're moving thousands of passengers a week at one location, you start to want to have much more like stringent procedure and security probably. So that's one example. And the second thing that I think is a change versus helicopter today is the connectivity. So when we think of eVTOL, we think of autonomous vehicle. Maybe they will not be autonomous at first, they will be piloted, but all the serious companies like Joby, Volocopter, Allianc, etc., that are building those eVTOLs plan to have autonomous vehicles, and then you add something that we didn't have with helicopter, which is like the connectivity risk and a data link risk, where is there a risk that this can be hacked, can be used by someone remotely? And that's definitely something that these eVTOL OEM are working on, but that's a new type of risk versus what we know with helicopter.
It's a good point. I would like to supplement that from safety angle and security angle. The safety part primarily is driven by the public entities, the regulatory authorities, and mostly, without any exception, they all lag behind. They are very conservative. They don't want to be taking risks. They are not rewarded for taking risks. They are rewarded just to keep it status quo. So, and that's going to be one of the key parameter in making these urban taxis kind of be normal or at least take off. So it is important for us to engage the regulatory authorities and bodies to encourage them to think about how to solve these problems. Security, not just only from the perspective of checking the passengers, but also my limited understanding on this, that such UAM, it won't travel too high, and with the defense stuff getting so popular that even a passenger aeroplane was shot by mistake somewhere a couple of years ago. So the UAM, we face a real threat of what happens if people wanted to just shoot it down. So those are the things that need to be considered observably to make sure that it's all about safety. If somebody is going to be concerned that this is not going to be safe, it depends upon so many other things within the city. It's not just only within the UAM perspective, but also from the police and public security, etc. need to be considered here.
Yeah, I want to apologize. We had some terrible internet problems, so got disconnected for a few minutes there. And I'm sure you had a good part of the conversation. I wanted to lead it back, if you guys agree, to the actual design of the vertiports. And we have just a few minutes left, and we had a bunch of questions come in. We hopefully answered most of them already. And if we haven't, I apologize, but we'll try given the conditions. But the question about the design of the vertiports around now, not the integration, but around the users. Let's talk about the passengers. How do we feel that the experience needs to be like? When we talk about passenger business cases like air taxis, for example, or like tourist applications, movement of passengers from airports to hotels, movement between islands. So there's a number of applications like Charles mentioned at the beginning. how do we see that experience? And I want to tie that to what you were talking about in security. When somebody arrives at the vertiports, what do we expect them to see? How do we expect that experience to happen regarding security, check-in, waiting time, maybe experience with restaurants and other real estate, and so on? Anybody want to jump into those? And go ahead.
I think, Felipe, if I can, for me, I think it's important that we also, like everything else in this space, we utilize technology. Biometrics, it's important. You don't want people standing around waiting for their passport or their ID to be checked. Simple, most national passports now have that piece in it that with all the biometrics held. If you can streamline that, make it as simple as possible for people to move through, link that again to their ticket so that, you go there, you flash your passport or your ID card, you go through and straight up to the waiting lounge and then straight onto the helicopter. Same thing is, simple, making it more attractive in terms of being able to easily access restaurants and things like that. Otherwise it's just going to be a bit of a pain in the butt to get onto the, to go to a vertiport. So you want to simplify all of that, but you still want to have the security. You want to have facilities for people, whether it's toilets, whether it's places to sit and just have a quick bite or pick up a book or plug in their laptop. All of that's very important into that experience.
If I can pick up on what Gary's saying, I think he's absolutely right. And just to paraphrase what our friend Daryl Swanson says, as far as the building is concerned, everything starts right at curbside. So as folks are arriving, no matter what manner they are arriving, they get inside the building. And so now we have to think, how is the building, and this is your question, Felipe, how does the building really facilitate the movement of our passengers, both into the building through all of the intake processes, all the circulation has to take place, security, the safety, check-in, and all of that. Let's call it throughput all the way up to the flight deck, wherever it is, whether it's a ground level or whether it's elevated, and queue up and be ready for the inevitable disruptions to the flight schedule that's going to take place, whether it's mechanical or it's equipment or weather or passenger issues or staff issues or whatever it is. There's going to be delays. And I'm just as an architect thinking about any vertiport as a building that has to accept the number and the volume and the flow of people that are supposed to be coming in to the volumes that we're all projecting for, both arriving and departing and leaving, those that are going out on flights and those who have come back from flights. We're dealing with allegedly a lot of people, and how they are managed, not managed, that's not the right word, how they are accommodated, throughout the building from the time they walk through the vestibule door to reception, to security, to the bathrooms, to circulation, to elevators, or whatever we have, and then out into their flight has to be very, very carefully done. We can't really just be looking at the efficiency of going from here to there, people are going to line up. No, we have to be thinking in very, very broad terms about the number and the volume of people that have to be accommodated here, as well as thinking about security measures, safety measures, and emergency measures. If first responders have to get to the flight deck in a hurry, we can't build in obstacles to that. So there's many, many parts to be considered when you think about, again, let's use the word throughput from the curbside to the flight deck and back down again.
Anybody want to jump in there, Carlos?
Just one thing, because I find this discussion really interesting. I think Clement was saying something around this. In urban transport, there's a big discussion around how should we connect different modes of transport in order for the user to not be devastated by having to change their vehicle every 5 minutes. And And there's even formulas to the level of stress that the person feels depending on how many transfers they have, the waiting time, and how they perceive the time that they spend, for example, waiting in a platform. And I think that is exactly the discussion that Charles was giving. How is the trip chain, which is how we use it in urban transport, how do we understand the trip chain, and how can we make it the best experience possible so that it is completely seamless and that the person arrives at where they wanted to go without any problem. And when you ask them how long was this trip, they don't say it felt like 3 hours and it was 30 minutes, but rather that they say it was 40 minutes, I think, because it is well connected and because you understand exactly what is the best combination. And in the case of any urban air mobility, you even have to include literally the ride in the elevator. Is that going to be a big thing? How can you? So I think there is, like, my insight here is that there is a lot to learn from each other, from what is already well known in the airline industry to what is already well developed also in even from bicycle parking. Like that is exactly what we're talking about. It's just a different vehicle and different scales of understanding.
Thanks, Carlos. Let's try to answer a question that we have in Q&As, Adriana from Pedro Donoso.
Okay, yes, Pedro Donoso is asking, what do you expect to happen with the urban development with this new technology, assuming that it is safe and affordable?
So what do we expect to happen with urban development? And I just want to add to that question, which is really interesting. The fact that we have probably two options in general, and we've spoken about this before, it's whether we build landmark types of vertiports that are architecturally beautiful in these futuristic places, where we expect people to have a different experience when they go in and use the service. And on the other hand, we have the more industrial type of applications where we're talking about logistics chains and probably freight transportation, not passenger. More modular type of construction of vertiports. So we do have those, and we have to balance that beauty and that futurism with economic viability. And we were talking about the need for our business models to make sense. So I want to just add onto Pedro's question, that point, how do we see our vertiports really being built? Anybody?
Yeah, on Pedro's question, I think the impact will be massive. Not only on development, but on people's behavior and way to live in cities. I think that realistically, if you think that you can, be in a location in downtown, a big city in 10 minutes for the price of a taxi ride seamlessly, then you would probably reconsider, living in a small apartment downtown, and if you have the opportunity to pay less and have a yard and space and live in the countryside or maybe 50 kilometers away, and again have this opportunity to hop very quickly. I think this is actually something that is very interesting with what's happening with the COVID and the lockdown. A side effect is the increase of people working from home and actually working from anywhere. And I'm living in the Bay Area where it's very expensive to live in the city, and you have a lot of people that start reconsidering moving away. And that actually is still, like, UAM is still very much an option for this trend, because again, you can still need to be downtown for either meetings or whatever, and have this opportunity to move very quickly. So I think my answer is not really on design, but more on people behavior. I think that can be massive and have a complete reverse of trend, where for decades everyone is just leaving the countryside to aggregate in the city, generating the issue we all talked about, and we can have a reverse trend where people are actually moving a little bit away from the city centers to live a little more in the countryside with those options to quickly go to the city if needed.
Yeah, I completely agree with Clement that perhaps if I'm given a choice, I'll live maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours away from the city, where I can have my family time and just go to the city just for the work if needed. That will change the behavior of where people live and how they play in a probably better, healthier life. You don't spend a lot of your time, stuck in a traffic, and you're able to give, all the healthier life to your family, not just only for yourself.
I think what COVID has shown us and shown the C-suites of most major corporations is that people can actually be productive and work from home. So that's going to change a lot of things in terms of, companies with their big head offices. Suddenly those are going to shrink to basically a few meeting rooms and a few hot desks for the odd meeting. We're going to have a lot more of that. But again, something like urban air mobility changes the whole focus to being able for people to link when they need to go into the city to meet with a major client. They can do it. But the rest of the time, they can actually sit on their PC at home in the comfort of their lounge or study and, kids nearby, being able to take part and enjoy that part of life again. Also means that for a lot of people that, the fact is that working for a major corporation, you could base yourself anywhere in the world and still be productive. And that I've seen a lot of companies. A friend of mine's just moved to Perth. So he basically services mines in Australia, services mines in Chile, and up in Canada, as well as in South Africa. And Perth just made the most sense. It's in the middle of everywhere. And when he needs to travel, he can travel. But the rest of the time, he's working from his home, even though the company has an office literally 15 minutes away from him. So things are changing. And we've got to take that into account. We've also got to take into account that today's helicopter services, I look at it, a lot of it is more champagne type thing. People have, like, for example, Blade has an SUV that goes and picks up the clients, takes them to the helipad where they sit in a lounge, have a glass of champagne, and then climb on the helicopter and fly to JFK. But that's not going to work for mass transport. So, somewhere along the line, we're going to have something between a train station and, the sort of private lounges we have today at the moment for helicopters.
Absolutely.
And to get that balance is going to be quite interesting.
So unfortunately, our time is up, and this really, really shows the fact that we are upon a number of challenges when we talk about urban air mobility. The vertiports actually bring all these different bits and pieces together, all the parts that we require for urban air mobility to actually happen, from the passenger management and integration into existing modes of transportation to make it viable for people to actually have an added value in using the service, all the way to the technical aspects of urban air mobility, like the traffic management system of our air vehicles, like the design for energy management, and challenges like choosing the location of our vertiports in the first place for it to actually make sense. So these are all the challenges that we are tackling, that we're all working on, and it just shows how real urban air mobility is, how deep we're all reaching into policy, into public acceptance, into aeronautics and airspace integration to make urban air mobility happen. And I wish that we had more time to discuss all these very interesting points. But I want to really thank you all for participating and being part of our panel, to our attendees to joining us. And I want to close by saying thank you all, and by inviting you to join our next think tank, which is next week on September 17th, about the innovation that we require for airspace integration and regulations in airspace. So thank you all, and I wish you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.